Welcome. Today we're doing a thorough exploration of a case that has, well, it's haunted Washington, D.C. for nearly 2 decades now.
It really has.
We're talking about the unsolved homicide of Robert Eric Wone in August of 2006. The material we've gathered provides this profound and, frankly, deeply tragic look at an extraordinary life.
It's a life that was cut short under circumstances that are so mysterious, so bizarre, they immediately triggered allegations of conspiracy, of obstruction of justice.
And when you really look at the core of this whole investigation, you see this massive, frustrating gap. It's a gap between what the Metropolitan Police Department investigators and later the prosecutors, what they strongly suspected happened inside that DuPont Circle row house.
Right.
And what the legal system, which is constrained by this very high burden of proof, was actually able to confirm in a courtroom.
And before we go any further, I think it's critical we acknowledge the immense suffering and loss here.
Absolutely.
For Robert Wone, for his wife, Catherine, for his entire family. The mystery surrounding his final hours is, at its heart, an enduring heartbreak.
So our goal here is to methodically trace the facts. We'll start with Wone's life, then move through the details of the crime scene, the complex forensic investigation, the specific legal maneuvering in the courtroom, and then what happened after.
Yes, and this isn't just a simple retelling. It's an intense examination of how the justice system grapples with cases where the physical evidence appears to have been meticulously and perhaps successfully compromised.
We're really focusing on what the official records, what the legal proceedings tell us about this central conflict.
Exactly. It's overwhelming suspicion on one side versus the absolute legal requirement of proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt on the other.
Okay, so let's start by unpacking Robert Eric Wone's background. I think this is necessary because his character, his achievements, they make the violent nature of his death just particularly shocking. It's hard to reconcile who he was with what happened.
It is. Robert Wone was only 32 years old when he died, and by all accounts, he was on this unparalleled professional path. He was a fourth-generation Chinese-American, born in Manhattan, raised in Brooklyn.
And his academic history was just sterling. I mean, he was the valedictorian of his class at Severian High School.
From there, he attended the College of William and Mary, and not just as a regular student, but as a prestigious James Monroe Scholar. He graduated in 1996.
And it's during his time there, specifically the sources say the 1992 to 93 academic year, that he first met Joseph Price.
And this is a critical connection.
A huge connection. They weren't just, casual acquaintances. The sources say they shared activities, they were in an honor society together, held high-level positions in the student government. So this pre-existing friendship with one of the housemates becomes incredibly important later.
Absolutely. After William and Mary, his intellectual path just continued with that same level of distinction. He earned his Juris Doctor, his law degree, with honors from the University of Pennsylvania Law School in 1999.
And professionally, he was exactly where you would expect someone with his talent to be. He started out by serving as a law clerk for Judge Raymond A. Jackson.
That's in the Federal District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia. A very competitive, very prestigious post for a young lawyer.
Right. After that clerkship, he spent 6 highly productive years at the elite Washington firm of Covington and Burling. He was specializing in commercial real estate law.
And we should pause on Covington and Burling because its stature in D.C. legal circles is immense. It's one of the top firms. Working there says a lot about your abilities.
And then, just 2 months before his murder, Wone takes on this major new leadership role. He accepts the position of general counsel for Radio Free Asia.
So he's transitioning from being a firm lawyer to a high-level executive role at a very young age. It's an incredible trajectory.
But it wasn't just his professional success. The sources are filled with details about his commitment to the community.
He was exceptionally active in the Asian American community. He served as general counsel for the Organization of Chinese Americans, the OCA.
And at the time of his passing, he was the president-elect of the Asian Pacific American Bar Association. I mean, these roles really highlight his standing. He was seen as a leader, a mentor.
Yeah.
And personally, the sources are crystal clear on this and very consistent. Robert Wone was happily married to Catherine Ellen Yu. They got married in 2003, and they lived together in Fairfax County, Virginia.
And it's interesting, once the investigation started, the sources went to great lengths to emphasize that he was, and the quote is, straight and happily married.
Why do you think that detail was so heavily emphasized from the beginning?
Well, I think this point about his upstanding reputation, his clear personal life, it's more than just biographical detail. It's a crucial element in framing the narrative of the case itself.
How so?
You have the words of Eric Holder, who was Wome's colleague at Covington and Burling and later, of course, became the U.S. Attorney General. He called Wone a kind and gentle man who was killed in the most horrible of ways.
So you have this established, high-profile, very stable reputation.
Exactly. And it stands in this profound, stark contrast to the shocking and sexually violent allegations that were later detailed in the police affidavits, and the nature of the crime scene itself.
That dissonance.
That dissonance is everything. It immediately signaled to investigators that something was being concealed, that the scene was staged. A crime of passion or a random street killing just didn't seem to fit the man, and the scene certainly didn't fit the story that the housemates were telling.
Which brings us to the night of the crime, August 2nd, 2006. This is where the circumstances just become deeply, deeply strange.
Right.
Wone was working late at his office. He had made arrangements a few days earlier to stay overnight at this row house on Swann Street in the DuPont Circle neighborhood.
It was convenient, about a mile from his office. He was just trying to avoid a late-night commute all the way back to his home in Virginia. A simple, practical decision.
The setting here is so critical. The house belonged to his college friend Joseph Price and Price's domestic partner Victor Zaborski.
And they lived there with a third man, Dylan Ward. The sources describe them as an established polyamorous family unit living in this very affluent, very prominent D.C. neighborhood.
So let's nail down the timeline, because every single minute here matters in how you analyze this case.
It does. Wone arrived at the residence at around 10:30 p.m.
The assumption is that the men spoke for a short time and then one went to the guest room to go to bed.
Right. And the sources placed the critical event, the scream, extremely close to that. Neighbors reported hearing a scream, which was later identified as Victor Zaborski's.
And when did they hear it?
Sometime during the 11:00 p.m. news broadcast, which means the scream happened sometime before 11:43 p.m.
Okay, before 11:35 p.m. Yet the official 911 call was only placed at 11:49 p.m.
And that gap of 14 minutes, maybe more, between the reported scream and the emergency call is one of the very first and biggest red flags that investigators flagged.
14 minutes is a lifetime in an emergency.
An eternity. What was happening in those 14 minutes? That became the central question.
Paramedics arrived on the scene incredibly quickly, about 5 minutes after the call. They were followed by Metropolitan Police Department officers.
But despite the speed of the first responders, it was too late. Robert Wone was tragically pronounced dead at George Washington University Hospital at 12:24 a.m. on August 3rd.
And the immediate observations made by those first responders, the police and paramedics, they're crucial to where this case went next.
They are. Price, Zaborski, and Ward all spoke with police immediately. They did so without legal counsel present, and those initial interviews were recorded.
And they all told the same story.
A uniform story. They denied any involvement whatsoever. They speculated that an unknown intruder must have gotten into the house and committed the murder. And they specifically denied any kind of sexual relationship with Wone.
But the first responders, the people who are trained to walk into chaos, they immediately sensed something was off.
Very off. The paramedics, who see high-stress, traumatic situations every single day, they reported that the three residents' calm behavior was unusual. It's a direct quote from the reports.
They noted that none of the men were screaming or visibly panicked. They weren't even actively directing the paramedics to where Wone was or telling him about his injuries when they arrived.
That initial lack of visible, normal shock, that put the residents under immediate suspicion. It just didn't add up.
And adding to this just bizarre picture, despite the early suspicion from police and the investigation starting to unfold, the three men participated fully in Robert Wone's funeral.
In fact, Joseph Price, his college friend, served as one of the pallbearers.
Pallbearer at the funeral of the man who was murdered in his home, while he and his partners were the only other people there.
The complexity of their public presentation versus the private reality that the police were beginning to suspect is just staggering.
Within days, the investigation takes a dramatic turn that ends up dictating all the subsequent legal proceedings.
It does. The police announced publicly that they strongly believed, they alleged, the crime scene had been tampered with.
And that statement immediately shifted the entire focus. It moved away from a search for some external intruder and centered it completely on the actions of the three residents inside that house.
The intensity of the scene examination really drives home how serious those tampering allegations were. Investigators spent over 3 weeks at the Swann Street row house.
3 weeks. That is an extraordinary amount of time for a forensic examination, especially if the story was just an intruder who grabbed a kitchen knife.
Exactly. They didn't just swab surfaces, they began essentially to dismantle the house. The reports say they were removing flooring, pieces of walls, a chunk of staircase, the washing machine, even sink traps.
So why such a demolition? What were they looking for?
Well, a forensic cleanup, if it's done well, can remove all the surface evidence. But the cleanup materials themselves, the dirty water, the used towels, the residue, it all has to go somewhere.
Down the drain, into the floorboards.
Precisely. So removing pieces of the structure, especially flooring and sink traps, indicates that investigators were meticulously searching for biological evidence that had been washed down drains or had soaked into the materials of the house itself.
That level of investigation, it really speaks to a certainty among the police that a substantial, meticulous effort had been made to clean up.
It does. And this suspicion culminated in the government's official theory of the case, which was detailed in a search warrant affidavit. And it was truly disturbing.
What was the core allegation?
The core allegation was that the evidence suggested Robert Wone was, and this is from the affidavit, restrained, incapacitated, and sexually assaulted before his death by knife wounds.
And that completely contradicts the narrative of a quick, random intruder attack. Restrained and incapacitated implies planning and control.
It does. And one of the most fascinating pieces of physical evidence that contradicted the intruder story was the complete lack of a defensive struggle.
Right. If Wone was awake and was attacked by an intruder in the guest room, why were there no signs of a fight? No overturned lamps, no scratches, nothing.
This is what led investigators to suspect he had been injected with some kind of paralytic agent, something to incapacitate him, to make him unable to resist, which would allow the assault and murder to occur without any struggle.
But did they find anything in his system?
And this is where we run into a major, possibly fatal technical failure in the initial investigation. Toxicology tests were performed, but they failed to find any common toxins in Wone's blood.
Common toxins.
Right. The medical examiner, however, was heavily criticized later on for failing to test for what they called exotic drugs. These would be fast-acting paralytics that might metabolize very quickly or require highly specialized testing that goes beyond a standard panel.
So they might have missed it.
They might have. And worse, perhaps most critically, the medical examiner did not retain a sufficient sample of Worm's blood for later, more sophisticated testing.
That failure to retain the sample is just immense.
It's a huge problem for the prosecution.
Because if the police theory is relying on this idea of incapacitation by injection, the absence of a sample meant that as forensic science evolved over the years, there is no opportunity to go back and definitively prove or disprove the use of an exotic paralytic.
Exactly. The lack of a struggle remained highly suggestive, but the cause of it was rendered medically unprovable.
Okay, so beyond the incapacitation theory, what were the specific staging allegations?
Well, investigators pointed to a series of very specific injuries. There were puncture marks on Wone's neck, his chest, his foot, and his hand. This suggested a systematic attack, not a chaotic one.
It doesn't sound like a struggle. It sounds like control.
And there was also evidence of some degree of suffocation, possibly with a pillow, which again suggests that the victim was under control and incapacitated.
Now let's focus on the weapon. This was a key part of the staging theory.
Very key part. Officials believed that a knife was deliberately taken from the kitchen, that it was then smeared with Wone's blood and placed near his body.
Why? To what end?
To create the impression of a quick, spontaneous crime. An intruder comes in, grabs the first available weapon from the kitchen, attacks, and leaves.
But investigators didn't buy that.
Not at all. They suspected the actual fatal wounds were more consistent with a missing knife from a set that was found in Dylan Ward's bedroom.
Ah, so the logic here is crucial.
It is. If the staged knife from the kitchen didn't actually match the wound patterns, it proves that the real murder weapon had been removed, had been disposed of, and that a substitute weapon had been brought in to deceive investigators.
Which is the literal definition of tampering with a crime scene.
It's the definition of it. And police used other specialized detection methods, too. They brought in cadaver dogs.
And what did they find?
The dogs reacted strongly to two very specific areas, a dryer lint trap and the patio drain out back.
The lint trap, that's specific. What was the interpretation of that?
The interpretation was clear. It suggested that someone may have washed themselves or possibly cleaned and dried wet, bloodied clothing in the back patio area and then used the dryer.
All in an effort to eliminate forensic evidence, potential DNA transfer.
Exactly. The lint trap became a real focal point, though the sources do note that detectives were later criticized for not following up robustly enough on that lint trap evidence after the initial positive hit from the canine unit.
So even with all this suspicion, the investigation was also plagued by setbacks, both external and internal.
It really was. 3 months after Wone's death, the house was burglarized
Burglarized by who?
by Joseph Price's own brother, Michael, and an accomplice. And the MPDC later stated that this event critically derailed plans for an arrest they were preparing to make in late 2006.
That timing is devastating. Did they ever say who they were planning to arrest or on what charge?
They never specified, but the implication was that the burglary contaminated the scene further and disrupted the momentum they had built.
And the delays just continued to mount.
They did. A year after the murder, Wone's widow, Catherine, she publicly voiced her immense frustration over the continuing delays, especially with the FBI crime lab's analysis of the evidence they had collected.
And the case itself was being passed around.
It developed what was called internally vagabond status.
Ah.
It was transferred to 3 separate prosecutors over the course of the first year alone. That lack of continuity of forward movement, it was just painful for the family and, demoralizing for the public watching the case.
And when you look at these big, high-profile investigations, these kinds of procedural and timing setbacks, they often erode public trust. They can severely weaken the evidence chain, which makes it so much harder to establish continuity when a case finally does go to court years later.
That's right. The combination of the medical examiner's oversight on the blood sample and all of these subsequent investigation delays, it created tremendous headwinds for the prosecution.
So after 2 full years of mounting pressure, of media attention, and after a high-profile press conference where Wone's wife and her attorney, Eric Holder, publicly pleaded for information, charges finally came.
They came in late 2008, but the absence of a murder charge was highly, highly telling.
It was. Price, Zaborski, and Ward were charged with obstruction of justice and conspiracy related to the alleged crime scene tampering.
They were not charged with homicide, and legal experts at the time interpreted that as a very clear sign. It meant that despite all the overwhelming circumstantial evidence of a cleanup, the prosecution felt they lacked the necessary forensic evidence, or perhaps a witness, to meet that high burden of proof required for a murder conviction.
The arrest warrant affidavit that the authorities released at the time, it was extraordinarily detailed. It was aggressive. It felt like a public relations move as much as a legal document.
It was. It asserted, and I'm quoting, overwhelming evidence, far in excess of probable cause, that the 3 men had obstructed justice by altering and orchestrating the crime scene, planting evidence, delaying the reporting of the murder to the authorities, and lying to the police about the true circumstances of the murder.
And that affidavit, it went beyond just the facts of the scene, didn't it?
Oh, it went much further. It delved deep into the defendants' personal lives. It alleged that Price had a prior sexual relationship with Ward. It revealed details about Price's alleged profile on ALT.com, which is a sexually oriented website specializing in S&M practices.
And legal observers at the time noted how unusual that was. The prosecutorial tactic of releasing such an extensively detailed and highly sensitive affidavit to the public.
The speculation was that prosecutors, knowing they had a weak hand for a murder conviction, intended this aggressive public release to put pressure on one of the defendants to break ranks,
to cooperate against the others.
Exactly. The speculation often centered on Dylan Ward, who was allegedly in a more subordinate position in the domestic unit. The hope was he would flip.
But that tactic failed.
It failed completely. None of the defendants turned state's evidence. They all maintained their innocence throughout the entire process.
So the criminal trial proceeded, but only on the charges of conspiracy to obstruct justice, which required the prosecution to prove not just that the scene was tampered with, but that the men intended to tamper with it specifically to hinder the murder investigation.
And that element of intent is a very high bar to clear.
During that conspiracy trial, there were some critical pieces of contested evidence. One of them centered on Robert Wone's BlackBerry.
That's right. Prosecutors disclosed that 2 emails had allegedly been drafted on Wone's device at a time when prosecutors believed Wone dead.
And that was a significant point of conflict because the defense tried to use that detail to support their intruder story.
They did. The defense argued that if Wone had been using his phone shortly before that 11:49 p.m. 911 call, it undermined the government's theory.
The theory that Wone had been incapacitated and then subjected to what the government called a long, drawn-out effort to sexually assault Wone before he was killed.
Exactly. It was a strategy designed to sow reasonable doubt about the prosecution's proposed timeline of events.
And we also know that prosecutors intended to introduce Price's alleged personal profile from that S&M website, alt.com.
Right. They were going to argue that it provided a context for the specific nature of the violence and the restraint that Wone suffered. They wanted to link the means of death to the defendant's private practices and interests.
But ultimately, the defense strategy really revolved around silence and just attacking the prosecution's circumstantial evidence.
They exercised their constitutional right not to testify. The formal defense began in June 2010, and they basically let the prosecution's perceived deficiencies in the evidence speak for themselves.
The verdict was delivered by Judge Lynn Leibovitz on June 29, 2010. It was a bench trial, so she was the sole decider.
And she found all three men not guilty. Not guilty of conspiracy, not guilty of obstruction of justice, and not guilty of tampering with evidence.
And this brings us to what is arguably the single most cited and most painful moment of this entire legal process.
Her explanation.
Her explanation of the ruling. She spoke for nearly an hour, and she drew this critical distinction that really encapsulates the limitations of our legal system.
She stated very clearly that she personally believed the men knew who killed Robert Wone, and that she believed the crime scene had been deliberately staged. But she emphasized repeatedly that the prosecution had failed to prove the charges against them, conspiracy and obstruction, beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the necessary stringent standard in criminal law.
So it wasn't that she believed they were innocent, it was that the prosecution couldn't legally prove they were guilty of those specific charges.
Precisely. The inability to prove the intent to obstruct, which is the key element of the charge, was a primary factor in her decision.
And connecting this to the bigger picture, the failure of that criminal trial didn't end the legal scrutiny. Not by a long shot.
No, the stage was immediately set for a major civil suit, which would operate under a dramatically different standard of proof.
And that was the wrongful death lawsuit filed by Wone's widow, Catherine, in November of 2008. She was seeking $20 million in damages.
And that suit was advised pro bono by her attorney, Eric Holder, who had been Wone's friend and colleague.
The civil suit was based heavily on that police affidavit, on the government's whole theory of the case. It alleged defendant's negligent failure to rescue Robert Wone after he was injured, defendant's destruction of evidence of Robert Wone's murder, and defendant's conspiracy to destroy evidence and obstruct the police investigation.
And it's important for listeners to understand why this was the next logical step. The standard of proof is completely different.
Right. In the criminal trial, the standard was proof beyond a reasonable doubt. You have to be almost certain.
It's a near certainty standard, yes. But in a civil suit, the standard is only a preponderance of the evidence.
Which means
the jury, or judge, must only find that it is more likely than not, so 50.1%, that the descendants were responsible for the damages or the destruction of evidence or the failure to help. That shift in the burden of proof is profound.
But unlike the criminal case, the civil suit never went to a final jury verdict.
That's right. It was settled on August 3rd, 2011, for an undisclosed sum and agreement.
And while a settlement is not a legal admission of guilt.
No, it is not. But the defendants did agree to pay a sum of money to the victim's family to close that chapter of legal accountability, even as the murder itself remained, and still remains, officially unsolved.
The case garnered just significant and sustained public and media attention. It really cemented its status as one of Washington's most enduring and mysterious homicide cases.
And the sources note that the case particularly captured the interest of the local gay community, largely because of the way the highly personal, private details of the defendant's domestic life were exposed so publicly in murder investigation.
There's still this public obsession with the unanswered questions.
There is. Amateur sleuths created a dedicated website to catalog all the investigative efforts, the affidavits, the court documents. It really demonstrates this widespread public refusal to just accept the official lack of resolution.
And despite the tragedy, despite all the turmoil of the investigation, Robert Wone's life is remembered through several really enduring and lasting memorials.
And this is so important because it demonstrates the extremely high regard in which he was held by his peers, by his colleagues in the legal and the Asian American communities.
Numerous organizations established scholarships and awards and conferences in his name.
For instance, the Virginia Department of Social Services established the Robert E. Wone Award for Exemplary Service. The Organization of Chinese Americans dedicated a workroom at their headquarters to his memory.
And we see his legacy codified in legal education as well. The Asian Pacific American Bar Association Educational Fund created the Robert E. Wone Fellowship.
And at his alma mater, the University of Pennsylvania Law School, there's the prestigious Robert E. Wone Clinical Fellowship.
But perhaps the most moving memorials are at the College of William and Mary.
I would agree. 2 benches and Chinese pistache trees were dedicated in his memory, and they serve as this quiet place for reflection on campus.
And the plaques on those benches, they feature a particularly poignant reference to one of Wone's favorite songs, which was Louis Armstrong's What a Wonderful World.
The plaques read, "Rest a while and enjoy the wonderful world around you." A scholarship endowment was also established there as recently as 2023. It shows his memory is still very active.
So what stands out now is how the men who were acquitted of obstruction, how they moved forward after all the legal proceedings concluded, and the very deliberate steps they took to change their lives and relocate.
A 2016 article revealed that 2 of the men had legally changed their names years after the trial. That's a major step, an attempt to escape the high-profile nature of this case.
Who changed their names?
Joseph Price legally changed his name to Joseph Anderson, and Dylan Ward legally changed his name to Dylan Thomas.
But Victor Zaborski kept his name.
Victor Zaborski, the 3rd defendant, retained his name.
And by the mid to late 2010s, they had largely relocated from the D.C. area.
They had. Joseph Anderson, who was formerly Price, was working for an immigrant advocacy group down in Miami. Dylan Thomas, formerly Ward, became a massage practitioner and a Pilates instructor in Fort Lauderdale.
And Victor Zaborski.
He continued to hold his position with the Milk Processor Education Program, or MilkPIP. It's a D.C.-based trade association where he'd been employed since 1995.
But property records show that Anderson and Zaborski owned a house together in a suburb of Miami at that time. So their domestic partnership continued.
Yes, and a 2023 documentary confirmed that Anderson and Zaborski were still living together in Florida and that Dylan Thomas had gotten married.
Which raises this important question that really summarizes the entire judicial outcome of this case. The criminal case ended with an acquittal. The civil case ended with a settlement.
But despite those legal resolutions for the 3 residents, the core question, who killed Robert Wone, remains officially unanswered. The murder case is still open. It's still unsolved.
The legal system was able to close the chapter on prosecuting the housemates for obstruction, and the civil system found a justification for a financial settlement. But the actual, factual determination of who the murderer was,
that remains elusive, leaving the victim's family and the public without any true closure.
So if we summarize the material we've explored today, we see this trajectory. It starts with a life of immense promise, tragically cut short by a violent, controlled act.
Then you have a crime scene that immediately suggested intricate, deliberate staging.
And finally, a legal system that, while recognizing and even acknowledging overwhelming suspicion, determined that the high burden of proof for the specific crime of obstruction just couldn't be met.
And the most compelling aspect of all this material is that the dynamic conflict between a profound, justifiable suspicion and the technical, rigid requirements of legal proof.
Judge Leibovitz's statement really is the heart of it all.
It is. Her personal conviction that the men knew the killer's identity, juxtaposed with her sworn duty to require proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It's a stark, painful reminder of the fundamental limitations that are built into our justice system.
And when physical evidence appears to have been intentionally compromised, intentionally manipulated by those who were closest to the victim, it creates a near impossible situation for prosecutors to overcome.
It really does.
You've explored the facts of this deeply complex investigation, the subsequent legal maneuvers. Now, consider the profound moral responsibility that rests with silence. When a judge explicitly states from the bench that she believes you know the killer's identity.
Versus the absolute constitutional protections that are afforded to defendants in a criminal trial, which shields them from ever having to testify against themselves.
That tension that remained the unresolved beating heart of this tragedy. Thanks for listening.